Gus Grissom, he again was pretty much a hard-nosed guy. You know, he wasn't going to accept any BS from anybody.
Was he apparently set to be the first man on the moon?
He would have been. I think it would have been potentially the first man on the moon, or maybe the first man to orbit the moon. I'm not sure what the schedule was alleged to be, but he, you know, it's well on record that Grissom was very sceptical about the technical state of the Apollo missions. In fact, he was so concerned about it, he did two things, and this is related in the Apollo 0 film. I don't think it's in the Superell films, but it's in the Apollo 0 film that you mentioned. And he was so concerned that he just got fed up one day, and he went to his garden, got a lemon, put a coat hanger wire and stuck it through the lemon, and he hung it on the Apollo capsule. And this is well documented. And when he'd done that, he decided, look, you know, this is just a total disaster. I'm going to organise a press conference to tell people that this Apollo mission is never going to get off the ground. So we can't even talk between three buildings. You know, he was in the capsule and he was trying to communicate with someone 3 buildings away, and he couldn't do it. The radio comms wasn't working properly. You know, so he was saying this is a total joke. You know, and that actually triggered an investigation. There was another guy whose name always escapes me, who did an actual investigation into the state. This was it would have been in 63 or 65, I forget the exact year, but this was done. So this guy, they held a press conference, said, look, we're going to do an investigation, you know, Apollo's in a state, we're never going to get there, we're never going to beat the Russians, it's going to be a real embarrassment, let's pull our finger out and get this sorted out. That guy ended up 3 months later, he was dead, and his family was dead as well. He was killed when his car went on a level crossing, and the train crashed into it. He was killed. And then of course Gus Grissom was dead. Because of the Apollo 1 fire on the pad. Now his son Scott Grissom, this is also in the Apollo 0 film. He made some inquiries and got documents released, which suggested that this fire in the Apollo capsule, which killed the 3 astronauts, had been set up deliberately. Somebody had actually put in a metal plate and sabotaged the electrical system to generate a fault, and they had pure oxygen in the capsule, which made the fire just flash fire basically, and they were killed within a few seconds. So that's a bit of a coincidence that the 2 people that were part of NASA that were very sceptical about Apollo's progress in those early days, they were dead. They were dead. And so going back to the Armstrong speech, was Gus Grissom a parrot that was talking and didn't fly very well because he never flew in the Apollo missions? Was that some kind of coded reference there? Could have been something totally different. I could be totally wrong. But you know, that's the way I looked at it. So there's that. And then, as you said, the Patrick Moore interview with Armstrong, that is also been analysed by Peter Hyatt, the statement analyst. That was done fairly recently by Richard D. Hall. That was under his initiative.
The thing under the Madeline case, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
I've seen
so
that.
Richard D. Hall's investigation of that, he basically he employed Peter Hyatt as a consultant for statement analysis to check what is the likelihood that Armstrong isn't telling the truth in his interview. And the likelihood that Armstrong is not telling the truth about having walked on the moon in that interview is very high.
Okay, so Peter Hyatt now gives his conclusions. He says Neil Armstrong does not linguistically connect himself to the lunar landing. This is evident in his consistent distancing language, including intuitive pronouns and passivity. What may have caused this? So Peter Hyatt now gives 4 possibilities. Remember, he's a professional analyst, so he's covering his bases here with these 4 possible reasons. You'll see in a moment why I'm saying that. So the first possibility is that there is a security mandate. So Neil Armstrong's been told, you're not allowed to tell anyone about what you saw, right? The second is that this is his baseline. So in other words, he talks like this all the time. even when he's talking to his wife. So, say his wife said, Neil, did you enjoy yourself at the pub? He would say, when you go to the pub, you do enjoy yourself if you have a beer with your friends. He goes around talking like that, right? So I don't put much credibility in option 2. Option 3, he's a liar. He's deceptive. Lack of commitment mimics deceptive language. The lack of personal commitment in context is stark. Like I say, Peter Hyatt obviously didn't want to put all his eggs in one basket. The 4th is unknown. Okay, so he's hedging his bets a little bit. But I know where my belief lies there. Personally, I think it's number 3. I don't think Neil Armstrong walked on the lunar surface. And you've also got to bear in mind here that Peter Hyatt is an American who completely believed the Apollo story. He wasn't aware of any conspiracy stuff before he did this analysis. So this is a 100% believer. Okay? So in his emails with me after he did this analysis, this is what he said. This was so unexpected that I ran it by another analyst. I grew up at age 7 with this account. There's a strong emotional connection with childhood national pride. The teachers repeatedly visited it, including newsreels. I did not expect this. I originally felt guilty wasting your money. Your money. But after the first few answers where he is linguistically nowhere to be found, I realized that there is more here than what is ridiculed. Heather too, that's his wife, who was also a trained analyst, is shocked. We both said the same thing. Things we dismissed as crazy years ago have been proven true more and more. We need to stay more open and explore.
All right. And this statement analysis technique, which you can look up Peter Hyatt, HYATT, and that you can find his blog and find out how he does it and what the principles are.
He's got a high success rate, hasn't he, as well?
Apparently so. Yeah. And so it's not admissible in court, but Hyatt concluded that Armstrong was not telling the truth because he wasn't associating himself in his language with him being on the moon. Yeah. He was talking about somebody else being there, and he was not associating himself in his language with being on the moon.
You can almost say Buzz Aldrin doing the same in the Bart Sibrel film and the interview.
There's a little bit of that.
He was separating himself from it, He talked to administrators, and stuff like that.
He was. He was indeed, and that's another interesting interview in the Astronauts Gone Wild film. In fact, all of those interviews are very interesting. So we could do the whole hour just on the astronauts almost, really, because Armstrong has got big question marks about what he said in his interviews. Obviously he never said, "Oh, we never went to the moon; it was all a scam." He can't say that. If you look at some of the things he did say, to me, it's like he's saying, "Well, actually, this is what didn't happen, but I can't say that. So you're going to have to work it out from what I'm telling you." So there's that, and then the other interview that's very interesting to me is Edgar Mitchell. That's another interview that's in Astronauts Gone Wild. Now Edgar Mitchell allegedly was the 6th man to walk on the moon, or the 6th man not to walk on the moon, as I've said in Richard Hall's programme, to the amusement of some. And again, he's a really strange case. Again, I clicked onto him early on in probably 2005 or 2006 because he was saying, "Oh yeah, I know people that have been involved in recovering alien bodies from Roswell and such." And I thought, "Oh, Edgar Mitchell's up for it then. He's up for disclosure."
So you're saying that an alien spacecraft came down in Roswell in 1947?
Well, on a ranch near Roswell in 1947, up north and west of the town itself, on a ranch.
What makes you believe that?
Well, but the old timers that talked about it, that the military people, the intelligence people from that period, who because I was an astronaut and went to the moon, were willing to talk about it. And even though they were on security oath, they wanted to pass on their stories before they died, and I was selected to do that.
Well, if the accounts are to be believed, yes, there have been ET visitation, there have been crashed craft, there have been material and bodies recovered, and there is some group of people somewhere that may or may not be associated with government at this point, but certainly were at one time, that have this knowledge.
So I was quoting him in my presentations that I was doing around then, articles and things. Edgar Mitchell, good guy, you know, willing to put his neck on the line, all that stuff. But then things started to get a bit murkier when I watched the Bart Sabrell film, because basically what happens in that is Sabrell goes to see Mitchell. Not a brilliant sort of strategy because it's ambush journalism, but you can watch the interview because he sort of shows Mitchell this faking the shot of the Earth, and then at that point Mitchell's become very uncomfortable, and basically he turns on Sabrell and says, you know, you've come here under false pretences, and I think you're an arsehole. Actually says that in the interview.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Kicks him.
Does he? Yeah. And
have you seen it?
No, I've seen Buzz Aldrin one. We conferenced him with similar things, and Buzz Aldrin didn't like it. He told him to go away, and
he punched him in the face. I
didn't say a bit, but I heard about it.
Yeah, you know, and Sabrell regrets that now. I think he regrets his approach to some extent, and it is very uncomfortable to watch. You know, you think, oh, I wouldn't have done that, or you're thinking, oh, I don't know. But the result is there. The result is there for people to see. It's plain as day. Mitchell was not happy, and then as Mitchell accidentally leaves the camera mic running because Mitchell says you can get out now. Basically literally kicks him out of the house just about. But then as we're leaving the house, his son, Mitchell's son, says to Mitchell, "Shall we get a gun and shoot him?" Literally, and that's on camera. You know.
Wow. I didn't. Okay. Yeah.
And then he says, "Shall we call the CIA and have him waxed?"
Yeah.
That's all on camera. It's all in the interview. As Sabrell's getting in his car and leaving.
I'm going to watch that now. Yeah, I'm interested in that bit.
I'm thinking, blimey, what's it? Who is this Mitchell guy? And then a bit later on, as I started researching more and more, you realise that Mitchell was mixed up in other stuff as well. Now, Mitchell actually says that he is the guy, for example, that brought Uri Geller to the US for tests for psychic ability in 1972. You know, so he was involved in the old Uri Geller stuff and bringing it to the US and doing all these, you know, experiments in ESP that they did at Stanford Research Institute. And Mitchell actually talked about this in this BBC documentary that was made called The Secret Life of Uri Geller. And that was released in 2013. And you can watch that whole 90-minute documentary. The BBC one was only 60 minutes, but they posted a 90-minute version on Vimeo, and it's on Uri Geller's website. It gives you the code to access the video and watch it. And in that video, Edgar Mitchell admits in the 1970s he was working for the CIA. He actually says that he was working for the CIA. Says it. And the other peculiar thing which I put into the article about Mitchell, because I've got a particular article about Mitchell related to all the moon hoaxing stuff, was that people would ask him what it felt like to walk on the moon, and he couldn't remember. He couldn't remember to what it felt like to walk on the moon. He said, and what he said was, well, I didn't really think it was a serious question because I was a scientist and I was doing scientific experiments. I didn't have time for feelings. You know, he didn't. I'm paraphrasing what he said. He didn't actually say that. And then he said, so what I decided to do was I asked for some help to help me remember what it felt like to walk on the moon. That's what he said. And he said that in an interview in 1996, I think it was, with Richard Hoagland on Coast to Coast. So he was asking for help to remember what it felt like to walk on the moon. Why would you need that? You know,
same with Armstrong as well. I remember Armstrong having memory lapses on certain things. He remembers, I think, about
and
stars.
Michael Collins.
That's right.
And Michael Collins as well in his book later on. I think Michael Collins backtracked.
Yeah, that's right. Collins did backtrack. So yeah, about going back to the Armstrong thing, because yes, you're right. Patrick Moore did an interview in 1970. I think when Armstrong was over in the UK, but it was basically a 7-minute interview. But as you say, Patrick Moore also asked him that question in the post-Apollo 11 press conference.
Yes, yeah.
I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may. When you were carrying out that incredible moonwalk, did you find that the surface was equally firm anywhere, or were there harder and softer spots that you could detect? And secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
The first part of your question, the surface did vary in its thickness of penetration. Somewhere in rather flat regions, the footprint would penetrate perhaps a half an inch or sometimes only a quarter of an inch and gave a very firm response. In other regions near the edges of these craters, we could find that the foot would sink down maybe 2, 3, possibly 4 inches. And in the slope, of course, the various edges of the footprint might go on up to 6 or 7 inches, and compacting this material would tend to produce a slight sideways motion as it was compacted on the material underneath it. So we feel that you cannot always tell just by looking at the terrain what the exact resistance will be as your foot sinks into a point of firm contact. So one must be quite cautious in moving around in this rough terrain.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
People can watch the whole press conference. I think it's what, 70 minutes or something, 80 minutes, I can't remember. Watch the whole thing. It's on YouTube. It's on NASA's website. Why shouldn't it be? It's a historical record of man's greatest achievement, surely, is it not?
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, skeptics say, oh, they're tired, you know.
Well, that was taken ages ago. After
yeah, but even if you're tired, the euphoric of it, if you've done that, you'd just be, you know,
exactly.
it'll go through. It's like when people who just won a gold, straight after, they're still like that, aren't they? They may be absolutely physically drained,
knackered,
but straight after they're still, oh, because what they've achieved, and look at that.
And as you say, the thing that we're talking about there was in that instance, Armstrong cannot remember whether he could see planets or stars from the moon's surface. I think Patrick Moore actually asked them about the corona, which is the sun's atmosphere. He was intrigued to ask them what the corona would look like. But again, they're pretty vague on all of that. And he said, oh, there were reports that planets could be seen from the surface of the moon, but I don't recall seeing any. Really? Okay. Well, you can see stars from the surface of the Earth if you look up, if you're not facing the sun. So I would imagine that they could arrange themselves, stand in the shadow of the lunar module so that they're shielded from most of the sun, wait for a few seconds until their eyes get used to the darkness. They should be able to see the stars and planets more clearly than we can see them from the Earth because there's no atmosphere. And surely they would have made a point of doing that. And that brings in another point which I remember reading, a very obvious statement really. Everyone talks about the Hubble Space Telescope being the first space telescope, and was it launched in 92, 94, I forget the exact year. In the 90s Hubble Space Telescope was launched. But what did they do with Apollo missions? They never took up an optical telescope. Instead they took, 70 kilogram or 100 kilogram or 300 kilogram lunar rover. Right. If they'd taken up a small telescope, but maybe 10 kilograms, 20 kilograms or something, it would have been the first space telescope, optical telescope, with some scientific value in doing it. Didn't do it. They didn't do it. They could have set up a space telescope on the surface of the moon and left it there for, quite easily to record stuff and transmit it back to Earth. But it would have been technically easier to do that and build a lunar rover. Which suggests that the Lunar Rover wasn't about science, it was about show. It was about, look what we can do. It wasn't about science. And of course, apologists would argue that the whole of the Apollo missions weren't particularly about science because it was all to do with the Cold War and stuff like that. But I think that was just part of the propaganda, of course. Which is essentially what the Apollo missions were, was as I've come to know. It's just 100% propaganda, really. Not just about the Cold War, but to cover other things up. So, that you can observe all the evidence and the facts for yourselves, and then you get onto some of the impossibilities. We can talk about some of those. We've already talked about the lack of space for the removal of the, getting out the capsule onto the surface. There are other issues that come up, for example, which are fairly obvious. One of them is not so much the radiation. A lot of people talk about the radiation, which is more difficult because we don't, in our everyday lives, we don't have experience of radiation and its effects. Really, most of us, do we? We can't. We can't go into a room and flick a switch and beam ourselves with radiation and see whether we die or not, or whatever. Or even not, I know I'm being facetious, but you couldn't. It's not easy for us even to say get some plants or get some, laboratory mice, put them into a cage, flick them and expose them to an equivalent of lunar radiation and see how long they last. It's not easy for us to do that. However, what is easy for us to do is to go to a car park on a hot day in the supermarket and leave our car there in the sun for an hour while we go and do our shopping and then come back to it. That's very easy for us to do, isn't it? And what's the first thing you do when you get into your car? You switch on the fan or you wind the window down because it's so flipping hot. So we know that when something gets left for an hour and exposed to the sun, it gets flipping hot. Now, the problem is far worse on the moon because on the moon there is no atmosphere. So you're getting radiation from the sun, which there's no atmosphere, so it doesn't get blocked. There's no UV blocking, there's no infrared blocking. All that radiation will impinge both on your spacesuit and on the Apollo, anything that's on the surface basically, which includes the lunar excursion module. So what's going to happen? It's going to heat up. How do you cool it? Well, you can only cool it by radiation. There are, as I think I said in the last video, there are 3 ways to transfer heat: radiation, convection, and conduction. And when you've got a car on Earth, convection comes into play because you've got air all around the car, so you can get rid of, you can generate cold air within the car and then pump that out into the atmosphere and get rid of the heat that way. That's not an option with Apollo because they wouldn't be able to do that because of the oxygen issue. So you've only got radiation as a way of getting rid of it. Okay, so you've got a slightly shiny surface, but you need to have radiate the heat like we radiate with the radiator or the fins on the back of a fridge. That's why the fins on the back of a fridge are black, because the black radiates the heat better to keep the fridge cold inside. And you have the heat exchanger. They didn't really have something that was powerful enough on Apollo. In other words, they didn't have a good enough heat exchanger. So how did they stay cool? How did they stay cool? They couldn't do it with convection. They only had radiation. They couldn't do it with conduction, because all you've got that's touching the surface, conduction actually goes through any contact surfaces. You only had the 4 little landing pads that were touching the surface. You couldn't dissipate the heat, you know, through the legs and into the surface. I mean, the surface is hot anyway. So how are they going to get rid of the heat? You know, they can't do it.
Yeah.
So it's really the heat issue which I came to realise, and it's quite obvious when you start to think about it, which is far more of a problem, or far more obvious of a problem than the toxic radiation from UV or cosmic rays or that sort of thing. And the key thing that I came across, which I think sealed it for me, was the picture of Charlie Duke's family.
Yes.
Which I think I mentioned that maybe in the last talk, but it's worth mentioning again. And you can maybe shove that into the video, because that.
And your experiment you did.
Yeah. Anyone can do that, and maybe do it slightly better than I did, because I did it in air, but you could equally do it in a vacuum as well if you wanted to do that. So here we have a family photograph. And over here we have an oven, and this oven is set to 100 degrees centigrade, and I'm now going to put this photograph in the oven. She's cooking some of my dinner, and then I'm going to watch it through the glass. And that you can see that in very short order trying to get a better light, but you'll see it when I open it. This is curling up within seconds. So I think that's a pretty convincing demonstration. And here it is. You can see it there curled up, and that's only at 100 degrees centigrade. The better way to do that experiment I did was to get a little vacuum chamber. You probably need to do it at the university or something. Although you could probably get a little vacuum chamber thing on eBay, and then use a halogen lamp to shine through the glass, and then shine that onto a photograph so it's in a vacuum, and see if it still convolves and curls up. Because as I said last time, you look at that Charlie Duke photo, it's lying on the surface of the moon. It's not curled up, the plastic's not crinkled. So the only explanation is that was shot in a studio. That was shot in a studio. Must have been shot in a studio. Can't have been shot.
It's been there 40 years.
Well, maybe by now. Maybe by now. But even on the, it was there probably even within a few minutes. It would have done that.
Yeah.
So that right there shows that Apollo 16 or 17 mission that was fake. That video that they showed us was fake. And so whatever argument they come up with, that's nothing to do with lengths of shadows going in different directions. That is basic heat issues, which anybody can
It's about
test.
100 degrees at the surface.
Correct. The average temperature, as I understand, well, the average temperature on the surface of the moon is 100 degrees centigrade. You can look at the NASA websites; they'll tell you that. The maximum is 140 degrees centigrade. That's why there isn't any surface water, or very little. There's some in some of the colder sort of clefts where the sun never gets to in the various craters and things. But 140 degrees boils off any water by definition. So you can bet your life that that's going to curl up a photograph like that, and you can check it yourself. So that's a key piece of evidence. Again, going back to sort of backwards and forward a little bit here, but one of the other things which is about the history of the Apollo program, which is significant, is how it got started. And of course, as many people will be aware, and I think it's covered in the David Percy films quite well, is that at the end of the Second World War, when the Germans had developed the V2 rocket program, and they were sending all these V2 rockets over and into London. And of course that's well documented, and people were killed by those, as we know. So that technology was, I think, some way in advance of what they had in the US. So as you know, at the end of the Second World War, a lot of these rocket scientists, main name that comes to mind, of course, is Werner von Braun, or Braun, which I think is just German for brown, basically. And so he went across, several others, and it seems that they helped to set up NASA's rocketry program in the 1950s. And of course then von Braun was certainly involved with the Explorer 1 mission, which was NASA's first orbiting satellite. I think it was 61? I forget these exact dates. Was it 58? Maybe it was 58. It's basically a couple of years, maybe no more than 3 years after Sputnik, that they got the Explorer 1 probe in orbit, and that was with von Braun's technical help. And there's another thing which came up in the Apollo 0 film, which I learned, that von Braun wrote a book. Conquest of the Moon was the title of the book. It is commonly believed that man will fly directly from the Earth to the Moon, but to do this we would require a vehicle of such gigantic proportions that it would prove an economic impossibility. It would have to develop sufficient speed to penetrate the atmosphere and overcome the Earth's gravity, and having travelled all the way to the Moon, it must still have enough fuel to land safely and make the return trip to Earth. Furthermore, in order to give the expedition a margin of safety, we would not use one ship alone, but a minimum of 3. Each rocket ship would be taller than New York's Empire State Building, almost a quarter of a mile high, and weigh about 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons. So that's what von Braun said in '53. Now, I will add something to this, because a few months ago somebody wrote to me and said, well, it's fair enough to say that, but actually what von Braun was talking about was a certain mission profile, a certain way of doing it, where they would basically take a lot more to the Moon than they actually allegedly did in the Apollo missions. So he was pointing out that what they did was they revised this scheme of the way that what they would send is, and so this mission plan that von Braun is talking about is totally different to the one that was dreamt up for Apollo. So that's why there's this factor of 10 or 100 disparity, but even so, when you start to think about,
it shaves a little bit off it, doesn't it, really, in a way?
And I still think that even when if you take into account that, okay, so they didn't take an enormous rocket back with them to the Moon so they could get back again, because you don't, in other words, you don't need as much fuel to get back off the Moon as you do to get off the Earth, for example. But even when you take that into account, say, well, okay, let's say the mission. Let's say the mission was valid and the amount of fuel they took could be calculated accurately and stuff. There are still some problems, like for example at the lunar module, the lunar lander, a few people will have seen that film of Neil Armstrong flying the prototype, which crashed on its first test flight very quickly on Earth. He
died on that, didn't he?
He nearly did, he just ejected in time.
You thought that would put him off?
Yeah, it would. But yeah, that failure, and it's rather a catastrophic failure to say the least, didn't result in any problems. The Apollo lander worked 6 times in a row successfully, according to NASA, both landing and taking off. If you consider that, for example, in whenever it was, 2004 or 2005, NASA deemed it too dangerous to go up and fix the Hubble Space Telescope, that they were originally going to not repair it, they were going to leave it until there was a sort of public outcry that they needed to keep that instrument going. And then a couple of years after that, whatever it was, they did organise a repair mission. So when you look at and this is all NASA's own stuff, they alleged, they went to them, they said they couldn't fix the Hubble. So what's changed? What's changed? So the von Braun thing, again, highly suspicious. We've talked about Gus Grissom. The other thing, going back to the photographs, is one of the interesting ones that's not talked about that much, and it's on the Orlis website. There's at least one good article on there, possibly two. Something called Parallax. Now, this parallax sounds like a techie word, but it's not really. It just means that, like for example, when you're riding along in your car and you look out the window, you'll see that all the hedgerows and things near you move very quickly in relation to your viewpoint, and things further away move more slowly.
Yeah.
And if you actually put your finger up and measure, make some type of measurement based on the speed that you're travelling, or if you take two pictures of a snapshot with your finger held up, say, you look, and you know that on the first picture you're in one position, and in the second picture you were 10 metres further over to the right, then knowing those two bits of information, you can work out how far away objects in the picture are based on how they've moved between the two pictures.
Right, yeah,
So if the object is further away, it moves less, and if the object is near, it moves more, so you can work out how far things away are. So NASA claimed, for example, that in the Apollo pictures there are mountain ranges in the background and objects in the background and rocks that are further away in the background. So if you have two pictures on Apollo missions that are taken close distance apart, you can actually work out how far away things in the background are, according to, and you can compare that with what NASA actually claim at the scale of the scene that these astronauts are in. That's called parallax. And there's a very good article, as I say, on orlis.com explaining this. Now, there's this chap, I think I've got his name here, Oleg Olenyk, PhD. He did this. He took several pairs of Apollo photographs, looked at the parallax between the two, and he basically worked out that what that NASA said was 5 kilometres away was 300 metres away. In other words, this was shot in a studio. And he even worked out, it's quite a long, complicated article, there's a little bit of maths in there, but he even worked out that it was filmed in a kind of like a domed screen. The screen was like in the inside of a dome, and he worked out that it was 300 metres away, and he worked out the curvature of the dome as well, and that's all in the article.
Wow.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So now he says, again, but skeptics will climb on board this and say, no, that's not actually true because his results were wrong. Now what he says in his article, that actually some of the images that he used have since been modified, allegedly because they've been digitally enhanced, and some of these effects have now been either removed or much harder to see than when he did his analysis. He explains that in the article. So I do think, though, that when you see his images, and it's pretty compelling that you can see that this again was shot in a studio.
Yeah.
And again, it's not to do with shadows. It's more technical than that. It's not just to do with shadow lengths, but the shadows themselves do present problems in certain pictures. That they do go in different directions, and sometimes are at 90 degrees, and that means that there is more than one light source. But that on its own isn't enough to say that these things were shot in a studio.
No.
So the parallax problems are worth looking at as well. The other one that comes up is the trackless rover pictures. There seem to be a number of these where it looks like the rover has just been dropped into a set.
Yeah.
And the tracks, when you try and trace the tracks as to how it's got into that spot, don't seem to be there. Now again, this is a bit harder to judge, because you could say, oh, what's happened is the astronauts have been working around the vehicle and their footprints have gone into the tracks and they've covered them up. You could make that argument. And again, if you look at some of these pictures, you think, really is that really why they're covered up? And the rover itself, again. People have picked me up on this, but I still think it's a very big problem in that the rover ran, I think, on fairly ordinary car batteries or some derivative of that. But as you may know, battery technology that we use here is quite temperature sensitive. If you get for example, when you try and start your car on a very cold morning. It will take a couple of goes. It will complain at first, and the power doesn't seem as good as when it's warmer. And the same, and in other words, and again, if you heat batteries up too much, they can explode, or they can give off gases so that they don't perform as well. And if you look at the LRV, which is the Lunar Roving Vehicle Handbook, that's on NASA's website, you can download it from one of their document libraries. It actually tells you what the battery specification is, its operational, bounds are, so it will operate. And if you look at that, you find that the temperature on the surface of the moon would have been considerably too hot for the batteries to operate successfully and reliably, according to their own documentation. Now, of course, when I came across this, and I think Gerard White's talked about this, and I put it into this presentation. Again, I've been picked up on this and said, well, actually, there are all these cooling fins, around the battery, which helped it to cool. And I'm thinking, well, maybe, but again, cooling fins are not as effective on the moon because there is no air, so it can't use convection to do the cooling. It can do some radiation, but it's really, I think you need the radiation and the convection to get the full cooling. So whatever cooling they put onto the battery is not going to be sufficient in my view. It's not going to cut it, not for the amount of time that they're using it for. And the other thing as well is that again, people have picked me up on, is something that Jim Collier I think had mentioned, is that if you look at the schematic of the Apollo rocket and how it all basically was built together, how the lunar excursion module and the command module fitted into the rocket at the top. It is alleged that the lunar rover was attached to the bottom on one side of the lunar excursion module. It wasn't on all the missions, I think it was 16 and 17 that took it up. But if you actually look at how that part of the module was fitted in to the Apollo rocket, when the lunar rover was attached, it was going to be a really tight fit. It doesn't look like there was enough space to have fitted that in. Now, yes, there is a video on YouTube of one of the Apollo missions. You can actually see them, unfurling this rover, because it was like all the wheels folded in together, and it was like like one of these push chairs or walkers that unfolds, for children's walkers or prams or push chairs, and the wheels kind of pop out. It's that kind of mechanism that they built, according to them. And you can see them undoing this. There's a video of this from Apollo 16 or 17. It takes them about 10 minutes to get it out, But I'm still not convinced. I don't think that would have fitted into the space. Problems with the batteries. Again, you look at the picture of the Lunar Rover vehicle from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images from 2009, which we'll come on to in a minute. Doesn't look anything like the Lunar Rover vehicle. It looks like a black smudge as if it's exploded. It literally looks like that on the 2009 Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images. So there's huge questions there as well. Huge questions. And as I've already said, why did they even take it? Why even take such a thing? It's just for show. Just for show. So there's that. The other thing that comes up was in the Jet Whitner film, the Moon Hoax Now, where there's one sequence where some of the pictures from Apollo 17, I think it is, I always get 16 and 17 mixed up as to what happened on which mission, but there was one set of pictures, about 10, 20 pictures, that have got stains on them, droplets of something on the film. And and so NASA, this is all written up in what's called the ALSJ, the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. They write up this incident, and then what happened was the astronauts apparently had little straws, and they could drink orange juice out of their helmet. And while they were walking, they had a little straw that comes to their mouth, and they could sip orange juice. And apparently what happened with this sort of smearing on the image, where there's a few droplets of dropped down onto the image, is, according to the ALSJ, what happened was that the film needed to be changed in the camera. So one of them went back into the Lunar Excursion module, changed the film, and then came back out again. And while he was doing that, he spilled some orange juice from the straw onto the plate. I think it's called the Rezar plate of the camera while it was open, and that's what caused the stain on the image. And it's all written up in the Lunar Surface Journal. But if you actually look at the journal, look at the sequence of images, and this is all explained in about a 10-minute sequence of the Moon Hoax Now film, you can see that it doesn't stack up. The order of things is wrong. The order of things is wrong. So what he comes to the conclusion is that the orange juice actually leaked out of the helmet while they were outside of the lunar module, because that's the only way that the sequence of photographs makes sense, right? So the orange juice leaked out of the helmet while they were outside of the lunar excursion module. That's what he concludes, and he goes into quite some detail as to why this is the only way it could have happened. And of course, if the orange juice leaked out of the helmet when they're on the surface, that means the helmet wasn't airtight because the orange juice was leaked out. Exactly. So the astronaut would be dead. It was shot in a studio.
Now this is the cover of Apollo 16 mission report, and let's go to the equipment section. Paragraph D, the residue plate on the lunar module pilot's 70mm electric data camera was smeared during a magazine change between extravehicular activities 2 and 3. Charlie Duke indicates that they wiped the residue plates down with a wet cloth inside the cabin in between the EVAs. When they were done with their work on the moon, they would go back into the lunar module, seal the hatch, repressurize the cabin, and camp out for the night until the next day, when they would continue the mission on the second EVA and then the third EVA. Now let's take a look at the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, and they are taking their cue from the debrief and from the mission report. In the brackets, their explanation states, each frame on magazine 116E shows a set of smudges. Detail of the smudge pattern change only slowly from the beginning of the magazine to the end. The smudges are undoubtedly the result of contact of a dust-laden, damp cloth with the residue plate in John's camera. So NASA, the astronauts, and the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal all march in lockstep, alleging that the stain happened inside the cabin in between EVA 2 and 3. This is because the surface of the moon is a near vacuum, and all moisture and liquid would boil immediately in the vacuum of space. And indeed, this entire story is a complete fiction. It's a fraud and it's a lie, and NASA knows absolutely with 100% certainty exactly when that smudging happened, and it did not happen in between EVA 2 and EVA 3 inside the cabin of the lunar module. It did not happen then. Furthermore, the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal is absolutely wrong in its assertion that this smudging happened as the result of contact with a damp, dust-laden cloth. And what you see is the familiar splash pattern of a spill. Something was spilled on the camera. This is a picture of the index for Apollo 16 from the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal at nasa.gov. And when you come to Geology Station 8, you'll see below that Traverse to Station 9, and instead of Geology Station 9, it says The Great Sneak. And when you click The Great Sneak, it brings you to Geology Station 9. And this is where the magazine change happens.
Did he say both change? Yeah. Okay. Tony, I don't have a black and white left. I'm going to run off a couple, John. Okay. I'm out. 3 frames to go and I'm out. Okay. Okay, magazine Bravo's got something in it. A few frames. You used about 50 on it yesterday, and we can use magazine Delta. Both put color on. Is that okay, Tony?
Okay, that sounds fine. Let's put Bravo on John since he doesn't shoot while he's driving.
And here are the final 3 shots taken with 107C directly at Station 9 during EVA 2. And these are not marked by the smudges. Concluding that magazine at Station 9, none of them are marked by the smudges. They are absolutely perfect.
Which one, Charlie? Delta for me and Bravo for you. Bravo. Right in the corner there. Set dark.
The image you are looking at now was the very last picture taken before that magazine change at Station 9 where they are now. This is 107-17583, and as you can see, there are no smudges on it. The very next picture taken with that camera is after the swap of magazines, and this is now 114-18444. And that photo was on magazine 114B. On the left, we have 18444, the very first image taken with the smudges. And you can see the pattern is clear, the dust has not grabbed to it yet. On the right is 18577, and this one was taken the next day during EVA 3. Compare the two stains. The streaks are the same. These are the same exact patterns. The orange juice dried, and it's stained in the same way. The streaks match. See the first long streak on the left, and then look to the right image, and that same long streak is there, and it becomes obvious that this is a spill pattern of orange juice spilled on the glass that persisted over 2 days. Every single photograph taken with camera 39 up until this moment at Station 9 during EVA 2 was absolutely perfect, and every single photograph taken with that camera from this moment on will be absolutely smudged. If the astronauts had wiped the cameras down with a damp cloth inside the cabin later that evening, we would not see the stain pattern the next day during EVA 3. And this is the moment that it happens. John Young drops his sample bags, and Charlie Duke comes over to help him reattach them to his camera, and John Young asks Charlie Duke to check his lens, and since we know that the very next picture snapped with that camera will have the familiar stain pattern on it, John Young's concern with his lens leads us to another possibility that the stain pattern is on the lens and not the res-out plate.
Dropped your bags again, John? Yeah, tape came off, Charlie. Oh, that thing did come off, didn't it? Yeah. Okay, let me come around and help you put it on. Okay? Yeah. Well, the tape's still there. This thing just peeled off front of the tape. Only happens in training. You got it. That's my lens. Turn into the sun. Okay. But your finger. It's okay. Wanting to see that.
So what has just happened to cause this stain pattern to emerge? The answer is orange juice. It has been well documented that the astronauts had a problem with the suction straws inside their helmets that allowed them to take sips of orange juice. The straws would accidentally squirt orange juice all over them and into their helmets, and this was a big problem on the mission, and the orange juice actually seeped into the neck ring, and it appears obvious now that the orange juice leaked through the neck ring at Station 9 and caused the camera to be stained, and that is direct evidence that they could not possibly be on the moon, because if orange juice could leak through the helmet lock, then the helmet lock was not properly sealed to protect the astronauts from the vacuum of space. And this is because the helmet and the neck ring, in order to be airtight, must also have been watertight, because water molecules are bigger than air molecules. So if water escaped, then oxygen also escaped, and the suit would not have been pressurized, and in that case, the astronauts would be dead.
As I say, it was shot in a studio. So you're stacking up these bits of evidence now. It's all in Apollo's archive. They try and say it didn't happen this way, didn't happen that way. No, you misinterpreted. No, we're not misinterpreting it. You hoaxed it, and because of the investment in it, you have both NASA have to protect it. They have to protect the hoax, and of course, everyone else almost all scientists that are in the scientific establishment, they have to protect it as well, because it's a science hoax on a massive scale. We're not talking about, a few results faked for the sake of a payoff from a pharmaceutical company of half $500,000. You're talking about a $40 billion hoax. That's what you're talking about.